Episode 4, Waterworld, Above and Below. My mother had met twin sisters, Randy and Candy, on her travels in Greece. Candy lived in San Diego. My mother called her, and off we went. My mother bought a little red station wagon, and I rode my motorcycle. Just as I came into town, a double rainbow arced over 405. I took it as a good omen. Candy was in fact a very sweet person, and we hit it off exceedingly well. Candy told me that her sister had joined a cult called the Moonies. I was to learn later that no one joins a cult. I stayed with her for a couple of weeks until I got a job up the coast in Oceanside. The job was a groundskeeper for a 180-unit apartment complex where I received a one-bedroom apartment as part of the pay. I joined a dojo filled with Marines and trained as much as possible. On the weekends, I learned to hang glide. We flew at Little Black Mountain. We started off on what was called the Bunny Hill. There we practiced takeoffs and landings. We'd run down the hill, push the nose of the kite up, and be lifted off the ground to fly for 5 or 6 seconds, and then land. After the instructor thought we were skilled enough, we walked our kites up the 150-foot elevation, a very steep grade, and took off from there. It might be 30 or 40 seconds to get down to the bottom of that hill. After we did that a sufficient number of times, we went up to the 950-foot level. This was a 30-foot high cliff face that fell away for hundreds of feet. From that launch point, you could just sky out. You could soar the takeoff to get an additional lift, and then there was a number of spots where you could pick up a thermal that would take you up and up. I loved seeing the curve of the earth from 700 feet above the ground. Parachuting was a real rush, but hang gliding is as close as you can get to flying like a bird. It was a tremendous amount of fun. Some years before, my mother had sold the house in Topanga. She left San Diego and bought a house on Horizon in Venice. She then gained custody of her grandson, my sister's boy, and he was living with her. I stayed in San Diego for a year. The following summer, I headed up to L.A. because I had heard Frank was back in business. The bust had happened 5 years ago. Frank had been busy while he waited for the wheels of justice. His main concern was his boat. The Roughneck had been seized after the bust. It was set to go up for auction. Frank, of course, was forbidden to bid on it. At that time, it's unlikely that he could have afforded it. It was worth $250,000. What the authorities didn't realize was that Frank had no intention of losing the Roughneck. As always, he had a plan. The Roughneck was tied to the pier in L.A. Harbor. The Marshal Service had put a watchman aboard for security, but mainly to attend to the docking lines as the tides came in and out. From wharf rat to deckhand to skipper, Frank knew everybody on the docks. He enlisted the help of a lovely young woman that was kept on a tuna boat because of her talent for fellatio. She started visiting the watchmen to help pass the long California nights. One evening, claiming it was her birthday, she was able to talk the watchman off the pier, and he took her to dinner. As soon as they left, Frank's minions boarded the Roughneck, stripped out all the electronics, radar, Loran, etc., then opened the seacocks and sank the ship at the dock. Not only did the Roughneck sink, but her price sank as well. Who's going to buy a boat on the bottom? Through a proxy, Frank did. He bought it for a song. Frank, as a salvage expert, had no problem organizing his divers, and using lift bags and big air compressors, he got the Roughneck to the surface. Nobody cared. Once the boat was auctioned, law enforcement had no interest in it. Since the engines weren't running when the boat went down, it wasn't difficult to get them going again. At the same time, the lawsuit against Ivan Tours was settled in Frank's favor for about $250,000. I know this money helped Frank stay out of jail. I don't know what deals were cut. I don't know if the Hollywood folks stepped up for Frank. All I know is that Frank did in fact get off with a couple of years probation for 7 tons. What do they say? The only justice in the halls of justice is in the halls. So Frank's back in business. The Roughneck has been raised and is running with the electronics reinstalled. He's diving sea urchins and doing some salvage. There's a berth on the boat for me, so I move aboard. We get a salvage job, a 40-foot sailboat and 100 foot of water off Catalina. The boat lay on its port side on a sandy bottom, which was a good thing. A hard bottom would have damaged the hull. If it had been muddy, we would have had to contend with cohesion. At 100 feet, your main concern is bottom time. You don't want to spend hours hanging off the boat at different depths decompressing. At 100 feet, you've got about 25 minutes bottom time. You must work quickly and be organized. There were 6 divers on this job. We would each make 2 dives a day. First thing was to sling the boat. We pumped water through hoses from the roughneck, which we used to excavate trenches for our slings underneath the hull. After that was done, we fished nylon straps around the boat and attached our lift bags. Air was pumped in the lift bags until the boat sat upright and was buoyant. Now the fun part began. As the boat began to rise, the pressure decreased and the air expanded in the lift bags. They were equipped with valves to vent the air to equalize the pressure. From 100 feet, you can ascend at no more than 60 feet per minute. Any faster, and you have a chance of getting the bends as nitrogen bubbles form in your body. As we rode the boat up, we regulated the amount of air we let out of the lift bags. If too much air was released, the boat would sink again. We got the boat to the surface on the first try and then started pumping it out. The hull was solid, we had no leaks, we towed it back to Avalon and got paid. I was still seeing Candy. She'd moved from San Diego to Santa Monica in Los Angeles. After a year or so, she finally had some word about her sister Randy. She said her parents had her kidnapped and deprogrammed, and now she was back home. My mother asked me to move in with her and my nephew, so he would have some male influence in his life. His dad was in jail at the time, so I moved off the roughneck to her house in Venice. Frank had organized a small fleet of urchin boats. I skippered one of them, called the Sandy, a 32-foot Ronnie Radden-built boat. She had twin Chrysler Marine gas engines and was probably the fastest boat in the harbor. On a flat day, she'd hit 70. Fuel at the time was very expensive. If we were going to a distant island like St. Nick, 4 or 5 of us would form a line and be towed out to the island by the Catherine M. She was a Seattle-built, 120-foot wooden tuna boat. The Sandy had a crew of 3, 2 divers and a tender. The time to dive urchins was November, December, and January. Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan, was closed because of the winter weather. The urchin business came to Southern California that time of year. Visibility was 40 to 50 feet on good days. Some days less than 20 feet. It depended on the weather. The water temperature was exactly cold. We used an air compressor. The air ran through 300 foot of hose, which was connected to our regulators. We hooked the hose to our weight belts. Besides our dive gear, our equipment consisted of an urchin net, which was fixed to an iron hoop approximately 3 foot in diameter. There was an attachment point for a lift bag. The lift bag was made from a car tire inner tube. The last piece of equipment was the urchin hook we used to pry the urchins off the rocks. The urchin spines were very sharp and poisonous. If you got jabbed by one, it was going to swell up and hurt like hell. I loved the life. Off St. Nicholas, we would get up at about 9 o'clock in the morning, usually to the greetings of the female sea lions surrounding the boat. The 3 of us would polish off a pound of bacon, some sausage or hamburger, and a dozen eggs. The divers would strip down naked, soap up with Dawn dish soap, and wiggle into our wetsuits. They were 5/8 inch custom-made commercial suits. Into the water we'd go. You could dive 30 feet or less all day without problems. However, you had to go where the urchins were. You could dive at 60 feet in the morning, come up for lunch, but in the afternoon you'd better stay shallow so you could dissipate the nitrogen you had accumulated in your body at 60 feet. The topography of the seafloor was spectacular. On land, the forces of wind and water shape the earth. The sea uses only water. The water cuts the same features you see on land under the sea. There are ribbons of stone, small stone, round stone, just like you'd find in a river bottom or an arroyo. There were canyons and sand flats, all under a huge, overarching kelp forest. Diving is strenuous work. Once you were on the bottom, you'd start picking urchins. You'd hook it, pry it off the rock, and using the hook, bat it into the net. Once you had a dozen or so urchins in the net, you'd use your regulator and partially fill the lift bag, just to float the net off the bottom. You find urchins in the kelp forests. They feed on it. On the bottom, you work your way around through the kelp that would snag anything it could. It would wrap around your regulator. We taped down the straps on our faceplate and flippers because it would snag you there too. Of course, everything is moving. The kelp is moving. The fish are moving back and forth with the surge. Anytime you're close to land, you'll have to deal with the waves hitting the shoreline and then coming back, and then slamming forward again. That's surge. Sometimes it was so strong you just had to ride your bag through the kelp. Sometimes you'd hook a rock and grab the urchin bag with the other hand and just blow in the current. There's always a pause in the surge as the water travels from one direction to the other. That's when you pick urchins. There were lots of nice flat days with very little surge. They were very productive. Each of our bags held about 700 pounds of urchins. When one was filled, we would use the lift bag to bring it to the surface. We fitted dish soap bottle tops into our lift bags so we could vent the air as we rose closer to the surface. Once surfaced, you'd swim your net over to the boat, unhook the lift bag, and tie it off. The tender would throw you another net, and off you'd go. The seals were great fun. They'd love to buzz you, come within inches, and then dodge away. If a fish and game officer came by to check licenses or for any other reason we needed to surface, the tender would give us 2 jerks on our hose line. We'd surface and see what was up. I feel 2 tugs. Go to the surface and look at my tender. He says he never pulled it. I go back to work. I feel 2 more tugs. This time I visually follow my line back and forth as it weaves through the kelp until I spot a seal playing with it. They like to interact with the divers. I was kneeling, picking urchins off a canyon wall, when a seal started tugging at my flipper. They're playful critters, but they could be a pain. But we were always happy to have them around because the rumor was that if there were seals, there weren't any great whites in the area. That's probably just a wives' tale, but we were happy to believe it. On the coast where we worked, a diver a year was attacked by a great white. Never eaten, just chomped on once or twice. We also lost a diver or 2 a year from the bends. We worked about 8 hours a day. If the Catherine M. had towed us out the night before, she would stand by to receive the day's catch and then take it to Hide, our Japanese processor in Los Angeles. This was a 7-hour trip from St. Nick. She'd unload in the morning and get whatever the divers wanted. Always great quantities of food, dry socks, an extra towel, whatever they needed, and then head back to the fleet. We consumed an incredible amount of calories. We had to. We burned 700 an hour. I described a breakfast. For lunch, each diver would eat 6 or 7 sandwiches. Our evening meal would consist of a T-bone steak, a head of cauliflower or broccoli, and 2 large baked potatoes per diver. For dessert, a giant chocolate bar, and then we'd fall asleep eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on Hawaiian sweetbread. We took full advantage of the sea. We would get abalone, lobster, and fish. As much as I ate, I still ran a deficit of at least 3,500 calories a day, which caused me to lose a pound a day. By the 5th day, I'd be cold, and I'd have to wear a shorty suit over my big suit. At that time, we were getting paid 25 cents a pound for prime urchins. Urchins weigh about a pound apiece, so in effect, we were picking up quarters. A good diver could collect 2 or 3 tons a day. This worked out to be about $1,500 a day. The boat got half share. The divers had to split fuel costs, pay the tender, and pay the Catherine M. 2 cents a pound to take the catch in. That left the diver about $500. It was great money if you consider that at the time, average daily pay in America was about $60. So that was the life. We'd keep our eye into the east in the afternoon, watching for the Catherine's mast to appear over the horizon. When she came, we might grab a shower, eat vast quantities in the galley, and on occasion a girlfriend might make a visit. The Catherine would make her circuit of the small boats, load our catch, and be on our way. On our boats, we'd be reading and eating, or playing chess and eating, or just sitting on the dock enjoying the evening, eating. If the weather was only good for a day or 2, we'd go out of the harbor, turn north, and dive along the coast. One day, there were just 2 of us on the boat, myself and the tender, and we were working right off marine land. They had a killer whale show there, just like SeaWorld down in San Diego. I was in about 40 feet of water, and a shadow fell upon me. I looked up to see the belly of a big male killer whale passing above me. It didn't help matters that a diver's faceplate magnifies things about 25%. It was big enough. I'll bet my heartbeat went up a little bit. I was awestruck. You would often find orcas off Marineland. I don't know if they were communicating with their captive kin or not. Divers took about anything that was on the seafloor, urchins, sea cucumbers. The Koreans would pay for any little seashells, cowries, mussels, and whelks. You could work out of a skiff along the harbor breakwall and make $200 or $300 a day. Divers would collect augerweed, a small kelp that's used to grow cultures in petri dishes. Big kelp cutters would harvest the giant kelp. The forest top floated on the surface. Starfish were the only thing that didn't have a market. The roughneck was used in the filming of an episode of Chips, a popular TV show at the time. The storyline was bad guys had robbed a toll booth on the Vincent Thomas Bridge. Ponch and John get the call and are on their tail as they're approaching the Henry Ford drawbridge. In one shot, the roughneck is approaching the bridge and blows its horn as a signal to raise the bridge. Once they had that shot, they used the boat as a camera platform to film the action which was about to occur on the bridge. The bad guy's side of the bridge starts to go up. The scene was written to have the bad guys climb the bridge to the very top, hit the brakes, and slide down the ramp into the waiting arms of our heroes. A camera had been mounted on the very end of the ramp to get the shot of the undercarriage of the car as it came to a stop at the peak of the bridge. The mechanics had worked on the car, and they had adjusted the brakes so they wouldn't lock. Otherwise, when the bad guys stopped at the top of the ramp, the car would just freeze there. The shot required that it slide back down. Unfortunately, the brakes were so weak, the car never stopped at the top of the ramp. It knocked the camera into the water and continued right off the bridge. The other side of the bridge was still down. The car fell straight down onto its nose and the other side of the bridge. Luckily, it fell on its roof. Falling in the other direction with the wheels down would have put it in the channel. No one was hurt except the camera. Frank told me to get my gear on and go get it. I did, and we made $400 for that bit of salvage. That episode is called Taking Its Toll. I think there's a shot of the mighty roughneck in there as it approaches the bridge. Frank had a larcenous streak. If he could figure out how to get something without paying for it, he did. He'd come by the boat and say, "Me and the boys are going shoplifting. Do you need anything?" They'd go to Home Depot, get what they needed or wanted, and figure out a way to walk out with it. Frank always had a story that created some ambiguity, some doubt about his motives. I never known him to get caught. He always had a backup plan. Frank and Teddy went to the Home Depot for a shop vac. They found the vac. Teddy put the box on his shoulder, and he and Frank walked up to the cash register. The place was fairly busy, and Teddy just walked past the cashier as she waited on another customer and out to the car. Meanwhile, Frank stayed in line. The reason for this was to make sure Teddy made a clean escape. If he'd been stopped, Teddy would have redirected the problem to Frank. Frank would say he was waiting in line to pay for the vacuum cleaner. They were just in a big hurry. He had to get to the airport in 45 minutes, and he was just trying to expedite the procedure. As it turned out, no one stopped Teddy, so when it was Frank's turn at the cash register, he bought a pack of gum. Los Angeles Harbor is a huge complex. It has acres of storage yards for boats and all else nautical. The generator on the roughneck was an old Perkins and had seen better days. Frank found a piece of scrap that may have been a generator. He scrubbed it down and took some time painting it a bright yellow. He put it on a pallet and put it in one of these big yards. He put it in that particular yard because there was a brand new yellow Caterpillar generator sitting on a pallet. A week goes by, and he sends a couple of the boys in with a pickup down to the yard. They got the yard guy to get his forklift and load the Caterpillar, and off they go. There was no blowback, but if there had been, well, obviously his guys had mistakenly taken the wrong yellow generator. The one they're supposed to get is right over there. Idiots. One afternoon, a drunken bosun's mate staggers down the dock, spies me on the deck of the roughneck, and says, "Can you cook?" "I'm on the Seabird, and we need a cook. If I wanted the job, I should go down and see Captain Bruce Watson, on the RV, that's research vessel, Seabird. Urchin season was over, and Frank didn't really have anything interesting lined up, and a sailor always wants to get on a bigger boat. The next day, I went down the pier to the Seabird. She was a 150-foot-long World War II landing ship infantry. Now she was a merchant ship. Originally, she'd been made with a ramp in the bow that dropped down, and about 200 soldiers could hit the beach. A traditional bow had been welded on her, so now she had a pointy end. She had a flat bottom and a shallow draft of 5 feet. I knew at this point a flat-bottom boat would pound the waves in heavy weather. She was made for a one-way trip to the beach, but she was still working after 40 years, and she did have a nice coat of paint. I found Skipper Watson in the wheelhouse. He was a big fella, a ginger with a full beard, about 40 years old. He cut to the chase and asked me if I could cook. I'd never cooked before, except for myself, but it's done millions of times, several times a day, in every part of the world. They even have books on it. So I said, "Yes, Captain, I'm a wonderful cook." The skipper walked me to the phone booth on the dock and called his boss in Seattle. His name was Cal Colson. Cal made me an offer of $2,000 a month, plus a half-day's pay for every day I sailed as vacation pay. The $2,000 a month was twice the money most people were making. Sounded really good to me, so I said, yeah. They were cookless, so I started later that day after I picked up Betty Crocker's cookbook, Clyde Claiborne's New York Times cookbook, and something called Meals and Minutes. I discovered the key to good cooking was the ability to read and follow directions. Between New York, New Orleans, and Los Angeles, I've been around a lot of good food. The cool thing about being a cook on an oil research vessel is you can order anything you want. We'd be out for extended periods. Some of the crews worked 12-hour shifts. The meals were the only thing that broke up the monotony. The ship was leased to major oil companies. Cal would supply the ship and the ship's crew. Shell or Exxon paid for the food, the fuel, and everything else. They didn't have a problem shelling out big bucks for prime everything, not just the rib, lobster tails, big shrimp, filet mignon, anything. Crew members could come by the galley and make requests. A case of smoked oysters, top ramen, or Jif crunchy peanut butter. I had carte blanche. I could get saffron or grains of paradise, any spice I wanted to use. There was never any question about the grocery bill. The ship's crew consisted of 8 members, the skipper and 2 mates, a deckhand who had to be rated able-bodied seaman, a licensed chief engineer and his assistant, myself and my mess man. The skipper and the mates drove the boat. They stood watches which were 4 hours on, 8 hours off, around the clock. The captains always took the 8 to 12. The able-bodied seaman was the same drunken sailor who told me about the job in the first place, Jim Hunter. He was a day man. He worked keeping the deck clean and all else shipshape. The engineers were pretty much on call. They did routine maintenance like oil changes underway, but when we were tied to the dock, they didn't get off the boat much. About half the time we were at the dock because there was something wrong with the boat. So the engineers had to get things working. Myself, my mess man, and the assistant engineer worked as ordinary seamen. The mess man is a scullion, a server. Go down to the hole and get a can of anchovies and some rum-soaked raisins. That kind of guy. The Seabird had 3 decks. The wheelhouse was on the top deck. You could enter it by climbing stairs on the outside or climbing a ladder from the inside. The main deck had a number of berthing cabins, the galley on the starboard side, and a large day room up in the bow. Below decks there was storage, the engine room, more berthing compartments, and a large computer room. The ship's crew serviced the charter party. It would consist of the party chief, biologists, geologists, computer and equipment operators, and navigators. We would leave the dock with about 25 souls all told. I had 35 on one trip. Oil companies would buy offshore leases. After they buy the lease, they have to explore for oil. The Seabird was part of this process. We would shoot the bottom and then go back over and dart it. Sounds painful, huh? You could liken the process of shooting to sonar. We towed a sparker gun, which fired 100,000 volts between an anode and a cathode, just like a spark plug. When it fired, it sounded like a bolt of lightning. We also towed up to a half-mile of cable covered in clear green plastic. It was about 3 inches in diameter. The cable was called a hydrophone, and it was filled with electronics. The sparker created a concussive shock wave that penetrated to 20,000 feet below the seafloor. The hydrophones picked up the echo and sent that info into the computer room. The information would be collated in the computer room, and they could print out the rock structures thousands of feet down. They would look for domes and structures called pinch-outs that could trap the oil. Really cool tech for the day. To accomplish this, we ran grids. Before GPS satellites, there was a system called LORAN. It was a line-of-sight navigation system and did pretty much what GPS does today as far as giving you your exact location in minutes and seconds. The ship was steered by the navigator, who received the LORAN information below decks. He guided the ship by talking to the skipper in the wheelhouse. We needed a degree to port or starboard or come to this heading. He tried to keep the ship's course as true as possible. This is what we did day after day. We ran lines. The sea didn't care about our lines. Sometimes we'd have to work in the trough and roll back and forth for hours. You'd have to hang on to something to move around. Sometimes, going the other direction, the ship would pound as it slammed off the crest of a wave in every wave. Once an area had been shot, and we had a profile of what lay below the seafloor, we would dart it. We used a 6-foot-long steel dart with fins and a point made from a 3-inch pipe. It was loaded with shot. It must have weighed 700 or 800 pounds. The tail was hooked to a half-mile stainless steel cable. The cable filled a big drum that was mounted on a winch so the dart could be retrieved from the bottom. I was told that oil always rises. We would dart where we found promising oil-trapping geological structures. The hope was that we would find oil on the surface above them. We would drop the dart, the spool would spin and release as much cable as was necessary for the dart to reach the bottom. We would winch the dart back up, take the 3-foot pipe into the geologist's shack, which was right on the deck. The geologist would use a hydraulic ram to push the sample out of the pipe. It would be bagged in a plastic sleeve and marked. We were darting one perfect night off San Diego. It was as flat as it could be, just with the slightest of seas. The sun was just down, and the sky was a bright pink that was reflected on the surface of the sea. The entire world was pink. There was just enough swell to make the cable spool shift slightly on its axle. It emitted a high-pitched squeak. Apparently, the dolphins understood what it was saying because they came in droves to the pink water. We were surrounded. We dropped the dart, and we could see the dolphins following it down. I'm sure there are better ways to spend an evening, but that was the best I could do on that night. That's the work the seabird did. So there I am in the galley, preparing delicious, nutritious gourmet meals, making sure they have fresh veggies every day, no frozen broccoli. I found it's not too hard to produce good food when you have a good product to begin with. It's hard to mess up a prime rib or a New York steak or lobster. It takes a lot more talent to take a secondary cut of something and make it delicious. One day I'm making lunch, I'm stuffing zucchinis. The skipper comes to the galley door and says, "What are you doing?" I say, "I'm stuffing zucchinis." He says, "Why?" I say, "Because they're good." He says, "These guys have got a hamburger mentality. You're wasting your time." Just then, a geologist comes into the galley. I say, "Stop right there. If you could have anything at all for lunch, what would it be?" And he says, "I'd like a Big Mac." I took the lined pan of zucchini and threw it into the sea. The guys were pretty much meat and wheat, that's all we eat. The experience with the geologist really helped simplify the menu. I had a grilled topside, and we made burgers and steaks and chicken a number of times a week. Meals were timed with the crew's watches. Breakfast would be from 5:30 to 6:30, lunch 11:30 to 12:30, dinner 5:30 to 6:30, like clockwork. I couldn't be late serving. It took about 7 hours a day to feed my crew of 25 or so, 3 meals a day, as well as cakes, pies, and cookies. The skipper on one trip was an old Swede named Sven. Captain Sven was licensed for any vessel in any waters. from a rowboat to an oil tanker. He'd been on all the 7 seas. I'd go stand wheel watch with him, and he fine-tuned my navigational skills with the compass, chart, and dividers. He was the best boat handler and seaman I'd sailed with. You could look out the port light and see the dock a block away. You had time for a shower and to change your clothes before you'd feel an almost imperceptible bump as we got to the dock. His antithesis was a skipper called Ricochet Ryan. The boat usually stopped after it crashed into the pier. There was no doubt you'd arrived when you heard a bang and got slammed to the deck or a bulkhead. When his boat handling skills, tying up the boat was akin to calf roping. I was the most agile of the ship's crew, so I would often help tie the ship up. Boat bondage, we called it. The skipper would bring the bow of the boat to a ladder that hung down the dock. I'd grab the ladder, get on top of the dock, and receive a line. Belay that and go to the next one, the spring line that was tied amidships or the stern line. The tide was out, so the boat was quite low compared to the dock. The mate threw a heaving line from the back deck. A heaving line is about the diameter of a clothesline. On one end is tied a knot called a monkey's fist. You throw the heaving line to the dock and use it to pull the hawser that's tied to the end of it. The heaving line hit the dock and started to skip back toward the boat. I went to grab it and was right on top of the car-stop timber that edges all the docks. I missed the heaving line and slipped. I was headed for the drink. There were 2 reasons I didn't want to go into the water. First, the ship is coming toward the dock. It's about 10 feet away. There's a big log, like a telephone pole. It's called a camel log, and it goes across the outside of all the individual pilings that hold up the dock. It's attached to a piling at each end with a chain so it can float up and down with the tide. I didn't want to get crushed between the camel log and the ship. And the second reason was I'd just taken a shower. So I dove like Superman toward the boat. My chest hit the edge of the upper deck, and I started to slip, but I was able to grab a hydraulic line. I clambered up and went down the stairs to the bottom deck to find the mate looking over the rail for me in the water. He'd just seen me leave the dock. He looked flabbergasted when I came up behind him. He said, "I just saw you fall off the dock." I told him he wasn't wrong. It wasn't until the next day that the skipper told me he'd seen me and he'd never wanted to see me get on his boat like that again. Jim Hunter was our able-bodied seaman. He was pushing 60. He'd been a Navy man during the Second World War. He fought in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where his ship had been hit by several kamikaze pilots. At one point, he was made a chief in a headhunter tribe in New Guinea for bringing them tomato seeds. He taught me a lot of rope work and seamanship, things I hadn't learned as a diver. Jim was an excellent drinker. One night, he couldn't maintain his balance on the bar stool, and after his second trip to the floor, asked for his beer to be handed down to him. We had a chief engineer who was another old-timer from the Second World War. He was a merchant seaman and would run the North Atlantic convoys to Archangel and Murmansk. In a single day, wolf packs had sunk 3 of his ships. The first ship, 8 crew members were picked up from the sea. The next ship, 4, and he was the sole survivor on the third ship. A lot of sailors met Davy Jones that day. The crew, like any other group, was a mixed bag. Mostly everybody got along. What else are you going to do in a confined space? Merchant seamen are the best read occupation on the planet. You lose radio and TV a couple 100 miles out, the curve of the earth. It's pre-satellite. There's always a lot of books on the boat, and we'd swap back and forth, plus we had a little library. I made a little side money playing chess and cribbage, but after the first couple tournaments, they weren't biting anymore. All in all, they were a hard-working bunch of psychopaths. Our hydrophone wouldn't be accurate in seas over 6 foot, so in late fall, with the season over, we dropped the charter party in Los Angeles and took the boat up the coast to Seattle. I got to meet Cal. I liked him. He said the crew's report on my cooking was really good, and he wanted me to come back in April for a trip to Alaska. I flew home to Venice with a plan to head south of the border. Dear listener, if you have enjoyed this episode, please share it. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you listen would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me and my Mastiff, Drax the Destroyer, on the It's in the Blood Facebook page. Or you can send me an email at jesse.eph it'sintheblood@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support.